You could say Eric had always been part of the family. My wife, Kate, and I met him during college, and over the years, he became one of my closest friends. He was at our wedding, was there when our daughter Emily was born, and joined every holiday dinner we ever hosted. He knew our routines, our quirks, and even the little inside jokes that only close friends share. To me, he was like a brother. That's why it felt natural when Eric's life fell apart last year, his messy divorce, losing his apartment, and Kate suggested he move into our guest house for a while. It wasn't just her idea, I wanted to help him too. I trusted Eric. I trusted her. What could possibly go wrong? At first, everything seemed fine. Eric kept to himself, worked on rebuilding his life, and occasionally joined us for family dinners. He was good with Emily, playing the cool uncle role perfectly. Kate even started helping him with his resume and job applications, which I appreciated. She'd always had a kind heart. But slowly, little things started to change. I'd find Kate laughing a little too loudly at Eric's jokes, her hand lingering on his arm a second longer than it should. They started spending more time together, helping Eric out, turning into long afternoons in the guesthouse or quiet conversations that ended abruptly when I entered the room. I brushed it off at first, telling myself I was imagining things. But then, the signs became harder to ignore. Kate would come home from running errands looking flustered, claiming she'd lost track of time. Eric began avoiding me, always having some excuse to leave the room whenever I tried to hang out with him. The breaking point came one evening when I walked into the kitchen and found them sitting too close together, their voices low and conspiratorial. They stopped mid-sentence as soon as they noticed me, exchanging a quick, guilty glance. "What's going on?" I asked, my tone lighter than I felt. "Nothing," Kate said quickly, her cheeks flushing. Eric stood up and mumbled something about needing to check on the guesthouse before slipping out the back door. Kate laughed nervously. "You're imagining things, Sam." But I wasn't imagining anything. I just didn't know how deep the betrayal went, yet. After that night in the kitchen, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Call it intuition or just plain paranoia, but I knew there was more to their behavior than they were letting on. Still, I tried to push the thoughts aside, telling myself I was overreacting. After all, Kate and I had been married for 10 years. We had a beautiful daughter and a life built on trust, or so I thought. But the cracks in our foundation were becoming impossible to ignore. One Saturday afternoon, I was out back fixing the fence when I noticed Kate walking toward the guesthouse. She was carrying a covered dish, which wasn't unusual. She often brought food to Eric since he wasn't much of a cook. But this time, something felt off. She glanced over her shoulder before slipping inside, and the door clicked shut behind her. My chest tightened as I stood there gripping the hammer in my hand. There was no reason for me to feel suspicious. Or was there? I told myself they were probably just chatting like they always did. But then I remembered the way she'd been lately, quieter, distracted, distant even during our private moments. I decided to test the waters. When Kate came back inside an hour later, I was waiting in the kitchen, pretending to prep dinner. "How's Eric doing?" I asked casually, keeping my voice light. "Oh, same as usual," she said, barely meeting my eyes. "He's still looking for work, but he's hopeful about a few leads." "Good," I said. "You've been spending a lot of time helping him out." She paused, a flicker of something, guilt, irritation, crossing her face. "Well, he needs it. He's been through a lot." I nodded, letting the conversation drop, but my mind was racing. Something didn't add up. That night, after Kate and Emily went to bed, I couldn't sleep. I sat on the couch staring at the TV, barely registering the show playing in front of me. I kept replaying moments in my head, Kate's nervous laugh in the kitchen, Eric's sudden avoidance, the way their voices always seemed to drop to a whisper when I was nearby. Finally, I decided to put my suspicions to rest. Quietly, I crept out of the house and walked toward the guest house. The lights were off, and everything seemed normal. I felt like a fool, standing there in the dark, ready to chalk it all up to paranoia. But just as I turned to leave, I noticed something: shadows moving behind the curtains. My heart sank. It was almost midnight. Why would Kate be in Eric's guest house this late? I stood frozen, staring at the flickering shadows. My mind raced with possibilities, each worse than the last. Finally, I forced myself to turn away and walk back to the main house. If I stayed, I knew I'd do something I'd regret. Inside, I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, waiting for Kate to return. When I finally heard the creak of the bedroom door, I closed my eyes and feigned sleep, my heart pounding as she slipped into bed beside me. She smelled faintly of Eric's cologne. That was the moment I knew. The next morning, I woke up with a pit in my stomach. Kate was already up, bustling around the kitchen and humming to herself, as though last night had been perfectly normal. But it wasn't. My instincts were screaming that something was wrong, and I knew I couldn't ignore them anymore. "Morning," she said cheerfully, setting a plate of pancakes in front of me. Emily sat at the table, already halfway through hers, chattering about school. "Morning," I muttered, forcing a smile. My mind was elsewhere. After breakfast, I decided to pay Eric a visit. I knocked on the door of the guest house, and it took longer than usual for him to answer. When he did, his hair was messy, and he looked like he'd just rolled out of bed, even though it was nearly 10 a.m. "Hey, Sam," he said, rubbing the back of his neck. "What's up? Just thought I'd check in. How are things?" I asked, leaning casually against the doorframe. "Good. Just, trying to figure things out," he said, avoiding my eyes. His voice was clipped, his body language uncomfortable. I nodded, pretending to accept his vague response, but my suspicions were only growing. Over the next few days, I started paying closer attention. Kate's behavior became more erratic. She'd leave for errands that took hours, claiming she'd lost track of time. Eric seemed on edge, too, making excuses to avoid me whenever I tried to hang out with him. The tension in the air was palpable, and it was driving me insane. That's when I decided I needed proof. Late one night, after Kate had gone to bed, I slipped into her office. My hands shook as I unlocked her laptop and started going through her emails and messages. At first, there was nothing out of the ordinary: work emails, a few messages to friends. But then I found it. A string of messages between her and Eric, buried under a contact name I didn't recognize. My breath caught as I read the exchanges, casual at first, but quickly becoming something more. Flirty. Intimate. Explicit. My stomach churned as the words blurred together. The woman I'd trusted for 10 years, the woman I thought I knew better than anyone, had been lying to me. And Eric, my closest friend, the man I'd welcomed into my home, was just as guilty. I closed the laptop, my hands trembling with anger and heartbreak. Part of me wanted to confront her right then and there, but I stopped myself. I needed more. If this was going to end, it needed to end on my terms. The next day, I bought a small recording device and discreetly placed it in Eric's guest house. I told myself it was a last resort, but deep down, I already knew what I'd find. The truth was coming, and I wasn't sure I was ready for it. That evening, as Kate said she was running out to the store, I watched her walk toward the guest house. She didn't even look back. By the time Kate returned to the house that evening, I'd already retrieved the recording device from Eric's guest house. My hands were shaking as I connected it to my laptop and opened the audio file. The first few minutes were quiet, just the faint sound of shuffling footsteps and a door closing. But then, their voices came through, unmistakable. "I can't keep sneaking around like this," Kate said, her tone both frustrated and breathless. "Sam's going to figure it out sooner or later." Eric's reply was low and soothing, the way he'd always been with her. Relax, Kate. He's clueless. I've known him for years, he trusts us too much to even suspect anything. My jaw clenched as I listened, the betrayal sinking in like a knife to the chest. They didn't just think I was oblivious, they were counting on it. The conversation shifted, their words growing softer, more intimate. I couldn't bear to hear any more. I slammed the laptop shut and buried my face in my hands, trying to steady my breathing. The confirmation I'd been dreading was now undeniable. Kate came into the living room a few minutes later, her expression perfectly composed. Sorry I took so long. The lines at the store were ridiculous. I glanced at her, my stomach twisting. How could she lie so effortlessly? How could she look me in the eyes and act like nothing was wrong? No problem, I said, keeping my tone even. Dinner's almost ready. That night, as we sat at the table with Emily, I went through the motions of being a husband and father. I laughed at Emily's stories about school, complimented Kate on her cooking, and acted like everything was fine. But inside, I was unraveling. After Emily went to bed, I poured myself a whiskey and sat on the back porch, staring out at the yard. My mind was racing, replaying everything I'd learned. The messages. The recording. The late-night visits to the guest house. It wasn't just the betrayal that hurt, it was the audacity. They hadn't just crossed a line, they'd demolished it, leaving me to pick up the pieces of a life I thought was unshakable. I knew I couldn't let this continue. I needed to confront them both, but I also needed to be smart about it. I couldn't let my emotions take over, not yet. That's when I decided on my next move. The following morning, I called a lawyer. I explained the situation in brief, careful not to give away too much over the phone, and set up a meeting for later that week. I wasn't sure what my endgame was: divorce, separation, revenge. All I knew was that I couldn't sit by and let them make a mockery of my life. Before hanging up, the lawyer offered me a piece of advice that stuck with me: gather everything you can. Documents, recordings, anything that can prove what's happening. The more evidence you have, the stronger your case will be. So that's what I did. Over the next few days, I became a man on a mission. I scoured Kate's emails, collected texts, and even installed a camera in the living room to catch any interactions between her and Eric. Every piece of evidence was like another crack in the facade of our marriage, and with each one, my resolve grew stronger. I wasn't just going to confront them. I was going to destroy the lies they'd built and make sure they felt the weight of their betrayal. By the end of the week, I had enough evidence to drown them both in their lies. The texts, the recording, and even a video from the living room camera showing Kate sneaking out late at night to meet Eric, it was all damning. But I wasn't ready to act yet. I needed to plan the confrontation carefully, to ensure there was no escape, no denial. That Friday, Kate mentioned she wanted to invite Eric over for dinner. He's been feeling down lately, she said, avoiding my gaze. It might cheer him up. I forced a smile. Good idea. It's been a while since we've all hung out. Her face lit up, probably relieved that I wasn't suspicious. Great. I'll call him and let him know. Inside, I was seething. The audacity of her inviting him into our home, into our family space, was almost too much to bear. But I played along, knowing this would be the perfect opportunity to start my confrontation. When Friday evening rolled around, I made sure everything was in place. Emily was spending the night at a friend's house, so it was just the three of us. I grilled steaks, poured wine, and acted like the perfect host, masking the storm brewing inside me. Eric arrived with his usual charm, a bottle of red wine in hand. "Thanks for having me over, man," he said, clapping me on the shoulder like we were still the best of friends. "Always happy to have you," I replied, my smile not quite reaching my eyes. Dinner was a tense affair, at least for me. Kate and Eric chatted easily, their chemistry painfully obvious now that I knew what to look for. The way their eyes lingered on each other, the subtle touches, the shared laughter, it made my blood boil. I bided my time, waiting for the perfect moment. Finally, as we were finishing dessert, I leaned back in my chair and said casually, "You know, I found something interesting the other day." Eric stiffened slightly, but Kate stayed relaxed. "Oh. What was it?" she asked. I reached for my phone and pulled up the recording from Eric's guest house. "This," I said, pressing play. The sound of their voices filled the room. Kate's face went pale, and Eric froze, his fork halfway to his mouth. I watched as the realization of what I'd done sank in. "Sam," Kate started, her voice trembling. "Save it," I snapped, slamming my phone onto the table. "You don't get to explain. Not after this." Eric opened his mouth, but I cut him off. "You don't either. I trusted you, Eric. You were like family. And this is how you repay me." The room was heavy with silence, broken only by the sound of Kate starting to cry. Eric stared at his hands, shame written all over his face. "I want both of you out of my life," I said, my voice cold and steady. "Eric, you'll leave the guest house tonight. Kate, we'll talk about arrangements for Emily, but as far as I'm concerned, this marriage is over." Kate sobbed harder, but I felt no sympathy. She'd made her choices, and now she had to live with the consequences. Eric stood abruptly, muttering something about packing his things. He left without another word, and I heard the guesthouse door slam moments later. Kate tried to plead with me, but I walked away, locking myself in our bedroom. I couldn't listen to her excuses, not after everything I'd uncovered. That night, as I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, a strange sense of calm washed over me. The confrontation had been brutal, but it was also freeing. I wasn't trapped in their web of lies anymore. I was finally taking back control. The morning after the confrontation, the house felt eerily quiet. Kate hadn't slept in our room, I didn't care where she went. My mind was preoccupied with the next steps. I needed to stay ahead, to ensure Emily's life wasn't upended by her mother's betrayal. When I came downstairs, Kate was sitting at the kitchen table, her eyes red and puffy. A mug of untouched coffee sat in front of her. "We need to talk," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. I poured myself a cup of coffee, taking my time before responding. "You've had plenty of chances to talk, Kate. What's left to say?" She flinched but didn't back down. "I made a mistake, a horrible mistake. But we have a life together, Sam. We have Emily. Don't throw that away because of one stupid." "Stupid?" I interrupted, my voice rising. "This wasn't some one-time thing, Kate. You lied to me. Over and over. And with Eric, of all people." I shook my head, my anger barely contained. "You don't get to call it a mistake. This was a choice." Tears streamed down her face as she tried to plead her case, but I couldn't listen. Every word felt like another insult, another stab at the trust she'd shattered. "I'm meeting with a lawyer today," I said flatly. "We'll figure out custody arrangements for Emily. But you and we're done." Her face crumpled, and she buried her head in her hands. I didn't stay to watch. Instead, I grabbed my keys and left, needing space to clear my head. I spent the morning driving aimlessly, ending up at a quiet park on the edge of town. I sat on a bench, staring at the lake, trying to process everything. The betrayal, the lies, the years of my life that now felt like a cruel joke. But one thing became clear, I couldn't let this break me. For Emily's sake, I had to stay strong. She deserved stability, and I would do whatever it took to give her that. Later that day, I met with my lawyer, Ellen. I'd explained the situation over the phone, and now, as I laid out the evidence, texts, recordings, videos, she nodded approvingly. "This is solid," she said. "With this, you have a strong case for custody and protecting your assets." The courts don't look kindly on infidelity when it comes to these matters. I felt a small sense of relief. At least I had some control over the situation now. Ellen outlined the next steps: filing for divorce, freezing joint accounts, and securing the house for Emily and me. It was overwhelming, but I knew it was necessary. When I returned home that evening, the tension was suffocating. Kate avoided me, retreating to the guest room while I cooked dinner for Emily. She was her usual cheerful self, chatting about school and friends, blissfully unaware of the storm brewing around her. As I tucked her into bed that night, she asked a question that broke my heart. "Daddy, why does Mommy look so sad?" I hesitated, searching for the right words. "Sometimes, grown-ups make mistakes," I said carefully. "But no matter what, we both love you very much." She nodded, satisfied with my answer, and drifted off to sleep. I stood there for a long time, watching her, vowing to protect her from the fallout of this mess. That night, as I sat alone in the living room, the weight of it all finally hit me. The life I'd built, the family I'd cherished, it was all unraveling. But I also felt a spark of resolve. I wasn't going to let Kate or Eric take any more from me. I'd rebuild, piece by piece, and come out stronger on the other side. The following morning, I woke up determined. The house still carried an awkward silence. Kate stayed hidden in the guest room, and Eric was noticeably absent from the guest house. After dropping Emily off at school, I decided it was time to confront Eric one last time. I wasn't going to let him slink away without owning up to the damage he'd caused. I drove over to the guest house and knocked on the door. No answer. I knocked again, louder this time. When the door swung open, Eric stood there, looking disheveled and defensive. "What do you want, Sam?" he muttered, barely meeting my eyes. I stepped inside, closing the door behind me. "We need to talk," I said, my voice steady but cold. "I've been holding back, but not anymore. You owe me some answers." Eric sighed, running a hand through his messy hair. "Look, I messed up, okay? I know that. I'm sorry. But it's not like we planned for this to happen." "That's your excuse." I snapped. "You didn't plan it. You were my best friend, Eric. I trusted you. I let you live here. You were part of our family." His face crumpled, and for a moment, he looked genuinely remorseful. "I didn't mean for it to go this far. It just happened." "Don't give me that," I growled. "You knew exactly what you were doing. You made a choice, and now you're going to deal with the consequences." Eric sat down heavily on the couch, burying his face in his hands. "I'll leave," he said finally. "I'll pack up my things and go. I never wanted to ruin your life, Sam." I leaned against the wall, my arms crossed. "You already did. But leaving is the first good decision you've made in a long time. Be gone by tonight." Without waiting for a response, I turned and walked out, slamming the door behind me. I didn't need to hear his apologies or excuses anymore. His betrayal had spoken louder than any words ever could. When I returned to the main house, Kate was waiting for me in the kitchen. Her face was pale, her eyes red from crying. She looked like she wanted to say something, but I held up a hand to stop her. "Eric's leaving today," I said. "And after that, we're going to figure out what happens next. But don't think for a second that this fixes anything between us." She nodded silently, tears streaming down her face, but I felt no sympathy. She'd made her bed, and now she had to lie in it. That evening, Eric loaded the last of his things into his car. He avoided looking at me as he climbed into the driver's seat and started the engine. I stood on the porch, watching as he pulled out of the driveway and disappeared down the street. A weight lifted as his car vanished from sight. But another weight remained: the future of my family, fractured and uncertain, still loomed ahead. With Eric gone, the house felt emptier but no less tense. Kate moved cautiously, her presence a constant reminder of the betrayal I couldn't escape. I buried myself in routine, work, taking care of Emily, and meeting with my lawyer, Ellen, to finalize my plans for the divorce. Kate, to her credit, seemed desperate to make amends. She'd started cooking dinner every night, leaving handwritten notes apologizing and begging for another chance. But I wasn't ready to entertain any of it. My trust had been shattered, and I wasn't sure it could ever be rebuilt. One evening, after putting Emily to bed, Kate approached me in the living room. She hesitated in the doorway, clutching a photo of our wedding day. "Sam," she began softly, her voice trembling. "I know I don't deserve your forgiveness. But I need you to know, what happened with Eric, it wasn't about you. It was about me. My insecurities, my weaknesses. I hate what I've done, but I love you, and I love our family." I stared at her, her words washing over me. "Kate, love isn't supposed to feel like this. It's not supposed to hurt this much." "I know," she said, tears streaming down her face. "But I'll do anything to fix this. Therapy, counseling, whatever it takes. Please, Sam, don't give up on us." I wanted to feel something, anger, pity, hope, but I was numb. "I need time," I said finally. "Time to figure out what's best for Emily. For me. For us." She nodded, her expression crumbling as she turned and left the room. I sank into the couch, staring at the photo she'd left behind. It was hard to reconcile the smiling woman in the picture with the one who'd betrayed me. Over the next few days, I started making changes. I froze our joint accounts, something Ellen had advised early on, and began shifting essential documents into a safe deposit box. Kate noticed, of course, but didn't protest. She seemed resigned to the consequences of her actions. Meanwhile, Emily began sensing the tension in the house. One night, as I was tucking her in, she asked, "Daddy, is Mommy mad at you?" "No, sweetheart," I said, stroking her hair. "We're just figuring some things out. But we both love you very much. That will never change." She nodded, satisfied, and drifted off to sleep. But the question lingered with me, a painful reminder that whatever I decided, it would affect more than just Kate and me. One evening, I found myself sitting on the back porch, staring at the fading light. My phone buzzed. It was Ellen. "I have the initial divorce papers ready," she said. "Are you ready to move forward?" I hesitated, the weight of the decision pressing down on me. Filing for divorce felt final, like stepping off a cliff with no way back. But staying in this limbo wasn't an option either. "Yes," I said finally. "Let's move forward." As I hung up, I felt a strange mix of relief and dread. The path ahead wouldn't be easy, but it was mine to take. I wasn't looking back. The day the divorce papers arrived felt surreal. Ellen had couriered them to the house, and I signed them at the kitchen table while Kate hovered nearby, watching every stroke of the pen with a mixture of heartbreak and resignation. She didn't say a word, but her presence was heavy, as if she were silently begging me to reconsider. After I finished, I handed her the papers. "You'll need to sign these, too," I said, my voice cold and detached. Kate's hands trembled as she took the documents. "Sam, Don't," I interrupted, standing up. "You've said enough." I left the house, the air inside feeling too stifling to breathe. Driving aimlessly, I found myself at the park where I'd often taken Emily when she was little. Sitting on a bench, I stared at the playground, empty now in the late afternoon. The swing set creaked in the breeze, a sound that felt both nostalgic and haunting. For all the pain Kate's betrayal had caused, I couldn't stop thinking about Emily. She was my anchor, my reason for holding it together. Whatever happened between Kate and me, I had to ensure Emily's world stayed as stable as possible. Later that evening, Kate approached me again. She'd signed the papers and placed them on the counter, but this time, she didn't leave immediately. Instead, she sat down across from me, her expression solemn. "I know you don't want to hear this," she began, "but I need to say it anyway. I know I've destroyed the trust between us, and I don't expect you to forgive me. But I hope, someday, you'll see that I'm still the mother of your child. And I want to co-parent with you in the best way we can." Her words were measured, and for the first time in weeks, they didn't feel like a plea for reconciliation. They felt genuine, even remorseful. "I don't know what the future looks like, Kate," I admitted, my tone softer than before. "But for Emily's sake, I'll try to be civil." She nodded, tears brimming in her eyes. "Thank you, Sam. That's all I can ask for." The next few days were a whirlwind of meetings with Ellen, arranging custody schedules, and packing up parts of the house to create separate spaces. Emily's questions grew more frequent, and I did my best to answer them without burdening her with the weight of the situation. On Saturday, I took Emily out for ice cream, just the two of us. As we sat on a bench in the sunshine, she asked, "Daddy, are you and Mommy going to live in different houses?" The question hit me like a punch to the gut. "Not right away," I said carefully. "But things might change a little. No matter what, though, you'll always have both of us." She nodded thoughtfully, licking her cone. "As long as you're both happy, I'm happy." Her innocence was both comforting and heart-wrenching. I made a silent promise to myself: no matter how bitter things got between Kate and me, I would shield Emily from it as much as I could. That night, as I sat alone in the living room, the weight of the past weeks settled over me. The confrontation, the revelations, the heartbreak, they had all led to this point. But for the first time, I felt a glimmer of hope. The road ahead would be difficult, but it was a road I could walk, one step at a time. Weeks turned into months, and the divorce proceedings moved forward. The anger and resentment I'd carried for so long began to fade, not entirely, but enough to let me focus on the future. The house, once filled with tension, had settled into a quieter rhythm. Kate and I had worked out a co-parenting schedule that prioritized Emily, and while our conversations were brief and civil, they no longer felt like battles. One Saturday morning, I took Emily to her soccer game. Sitting on the sidelines, surrounded by other parents cheering their kids on, I realized how much I'd missed the simple joys of life. Watching Emily dart across the field, her laughter carrying over the noise, was a reminder of what truly mattered. After the game, as we walked to the car, she slipped her hand into mine. "Daddy, are you happy?" she asked, her big eyes looking up at me with concern. I smiled, squeezing her hand gently. "I'm getting there, sweetheart. Having you makes me very happy." Meanwhile, Kate was making changes of her own. She'd moved into an apartment a few miles away and started therapy, something she'd mentioned during one of our few meaningful conversations since everything fell apart. "I'm trying to figure out why I made the choices I did," she'd said. "For Emily's sake, and maybe for mine, too." I didn't respond at the time, but I appreciated the effort. While I wasn't ready to forgive her, I could see that she was trying to grow from the mistakes she'd made. That was all I could ask. As for Eric, he was gone for good. The last I heard, he'd moved out of town, likely realizing he'd burned too many bridges to stay. I didn't care to know where he was or what he was doing. He was a chapter I'd closed for good. Life became about rebuilding, piece by piece. I poured myself into work, took up running to clear my mind, and even reconnected with a few old friends I'd lost touch with over the years. Slowly, the pain of betrayal loosened its grip, replaced by a sense of resilience I hadn't known I possessed. One evening, as Emily and I were building a fort in the living room, she looked at me with a smile that melted every worry I'd ever had. "You're the best, Daddy," she said, her voice filled with love. At that moment, I realized something important: my world hadn't ended. It had changed, drastically, painfully, but it hadn't ended. And in its place, I had the chance to build something stronger, something better. For the first time in months, I felt at peace. I didn't have all the answers, but I had a clear path forward. And for now, that was enough.